Oh, it feels so good to be back in the park doing videos. It has been way too long, and although it was needed, and I explained why, I so missed being here in the park and doing videos. I hope I am not rusty, so bear with me in today's episode, which is about the stomach. But I do hope you enjoy it still. I just miss looking at these as well. So, why have I been away? I apologize first of all. But if you notice, in the past 28 episodes in this series, over 6 hours worth of content was produced. And nothing was planned before. I decided on the first episode that I'm going to try and make 30 high quality YouTube videos that are very informative, but also a bit funny, or quite funny, so that people can enjoy them. You learn a little bit as well, you get to see some nature. Now, nothing was planned before. So I was spending a good 4 or 5 hours a day thinking of the topic, producing some notes, shooting the video here, editing, producing the thumbnails, everything else that goes with it. And I'm going to produce a separate video on that. But that's on top of working still. So I'm not on furlough. I am so thankfully very grateful enough to work. So that's not easy. And believe me, I wanted just to hit that 30 episodes and rest, but my body and my mind was just so saturated that I didn't want to produce 3 very poor quality videos to end the series so far, because I'm going to continue with this type of format, this vlog, this series. This is just going to be the first season, so these 30 episodes. So we've got 28 today, 29 later on in the week, and 30th on weekend. That's going to be season 1. But I didn't want to finish the first ever season of this type of video for myself on a very low note, hence why I did stop. But whether you're following on LinkedIn as well or Instagram, you've seen that I've still been busy in a different type of video or production of that video, which is building my bedroom studio. So I'll put it here, which you'll see in now 3, 2, 1. So you can see it now. Something I've spent a good few weeks trying to design and set up. It's a nice, quite a nice backdrop, which will hopefully be for more in-house, slightly longer, more storytelling videos, which I'll do in the comfort of my bedroom, aka YouTube studio. Okay, I'm really sorry, but I really miss seeing nature as well, because I've not been here for so long. Right, I'm being serious now, back to stomach. So you've noticed throughout this series that I've touched upon different organs, tried to tell some interesting insights, some knowledge that you probably haven't heard before, whether it's in school or generally on day to day, and give you some insights that are going to be really beneficial for you day to day as well, and something that's quite interesting to know. And today's episode is no exception, because even though it's on the stomach, I've seen it within research and talking to people that it's very underrated, underappreciated organ. And we know that every organ has its function, from the brain to the heart to the lungs. But sometimes the stomach gets underrated and actually gets abused, which is what I'm going to be talking about today as well. So going into the stomach itself, there are 3 main functions. Now the first one, believe it or not, is where the stomach holds as a holding chamber for food. So for around about 2 hours, whatever food that comes in can be held in the stomach before it goes in the small intestine, so it can be processed. Because the issue is that we can take in food a lot quicker than we can actually digest and process the food into our bloodstream. So that's why sometimes when you eat a really large meal, you actually feel yourself getting fatter, and that's the stomach actually holding the food before it gets processed. Now number 2 is where the stomach actually physically and mechanically breaks down the food into smaller little chunks, so it can actually be digested and processed by the third step, which we're going to be talking about. So the stomach actually contracts and relaxes, regardless of the acid that is there, regardless of the enzymes that are there. The stomach actually contracts and relaxes to basically pummel and grind that food together. Hence the title of this episode, our very own food mixer. Now I want you to decide. You can either watch the view, or you can answer this question, which is, what other organ in our body also contracts and relaxes to do something? Are there multiple ones, or are there one? If you look at the view, I don't blame you, but if you're interested in the question, you're more than welcome to answer. But for those who are interested in the view, there you go. I have missed this one. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. The view and the question I've asked. So now moving on to the third function, which is very similar to the second one which I've just highlighted. It's actual digestion of the food that have just been broken down mechanically by the whole contraction and relaxation. And this is where the acidic nature of the stomach comes in. We know that the stomach has very potent, very acidic hydrochloric acid, which helps to break down the food, helps to unravel the proteins, so it can be broken down into those smaller constituents, amino acids, for fats, fatty acids. But then it allows the digestion enzymes, so we touched upon enzymes in this episode here, where they can actually now process the food a lot quicker into a form that we can actually make use of and process and utilize. So the whole digestion of food is incredibly important before it gets into the small intestine where it gets absorbed. So now you know 3 basic functions of the stomach: a little bit of a holding chamber for food that's coming in before it gets into the duodenum, which is the early part of the small intestine. Helps to break down the food mechanically during the whole contraction and relaxation, and that helps to digest the actual food via the acid, the stomach acid, and also the digestion enzymes, which are both secreted by something known as a parietal cell, in simple terms, the stomach cell. So as you can see in the whole digestive system, from taking it from the mouth, and the mouth actually using saliva and using the actual mechanical movement, which is what I'm doing right now to break down the food, all the way down to the small intestine, which is then used to absorb it into the bloodstream, so you can go where it needs to go and get utilized where it needs to be utilized. So you can see how the stomach actually plays quite a crucial role, quite an important role in our whole processing of food and drink. But I touched upon stomach acid for a reason, and here's why. So sometimes stomach acid gets a bit of a bad press because it's related to, in people's mind, it's related to some sort of heartburn, acid reflux, GERD, which is gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now, although this is true and this is very heavily related to stomach acid, the way it's articulated can sometimes be a misconception, and you may often hear the case of there's too much buildup of stomach acid, there's an increase in stomach acid. It's not entirely accurate, and hopefully what I'm about to say can break down some misconceptions about why stomach acid is really useful and why certain diets can actually affect the way stomach acid is actually being utilized. So I mentioned earlier about stomach acid being highly acidic and really useful for digestion of certain foods that are coming into the stomach before it goes into the small intestine. But another key benefit of the stomach acid is it helps to actually fight off infections that might have come in. So pathogens that might have come in, so very harmful bacteria. The very potent acidic hydrochloric acid that's produced in the stomach actually helps to destabilize and neutralize the pathogens that are coming in. So it has a really useful aspect to fight off infections. So there's 2 very key benefits of stomach acid. Remember, it's being produced by the stomach wall, so something known as the parietal cell, which I mentioned quite earlier. But here's where the misconception actually occurs in regards to how does stomach acid relate to the issues known as heartburn, acid reflux, which is sometimes a misconception in the name itself, and even GERD, or GERD, as I mentioned earlier, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Here's the interesting part. So just between the end of the esophagus and the stomach is a little bit of muscle known as the lower esophageal sphincter, LES. And that actual job is to keep acid in the stomach and prevent it going backwards up into the esophagus and causing that burning sensation, that heartburn type symptoms. What unfortunately happens sometimes is, remember, this is an involuntary muscle, so I can't control what happens right now. I can only eat what I can and let the body do the rest. But unfortunately, when certain foods are actually eaten, it helps to relax, well, not help, it actually unfortunately relaxes the LES muscles and causes stomach acid to go back up into the esophagus and to cause that irritation that we hear. So heartburn is a symptom of acid reflux, and GERD, so gastroesophageal reflux disease, is a severe form of acid reflux. So now you know, and now you hopefully know the distinction between the 3. Heartburn is a symptom of acid reflux, and GERD is a severe form of acid reflux. So when certain processed foods and unhealthy foods, to make it simple, are eaten quite often, they can cause the unfortunate and abnormal relaxation of that particular muscle. So it's nothing to do with actually too much stomach acid. It's to do with what happens to the stomach acid if that little bit of muscle is affected. And another way where the stomach acid shoots up into the esophagus, causing that irritation, that chest pain, Sometimes coughing and breathing, feeling nauseated, all those classic symptoms related to acid reflux, is when certain types of those foods that are eaten cause a decrease in the stomach actually emptying those foods down into the small intestine. So this decrease in stomach emptying, something known as gastroparesis, is when there causes a buildup of pressure into the stomach, and that buildup of pressure actually overcomes the muscle, the lower esophageal sphincter, the LES muscles, and it overcomes them and causes the actual pressure to be released by opening it and actually shooting stomach acid back up into the esophagus. And that's another way where stomach acid actually gets back up in here and causes the irritation that we see. And a lot of it is due to sometimes of your poor inactivity, a lack of water, which I want to talk about right at the end of today's episode. But a lot of what we eat affects that lower esophageal sphincter, which then affects how the stomach acid is kept or unfortunately not kept in the stomach. So it's less to do with actually stomach acid being too high or there's too much of it, but more to do with what actually happens to stomach acid. However, there's unfortunate cases where you can have an excess or overproduction of stomach acid, and here's one of the kind of conditions that cause that. So something known as Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which I'll put over here, is when unfortunate tumours are formed in the pancreas and the duodenum, so that's the early part of the small intestine. And these tumours start to affect the production of a hormone known as gastrin, and hence the term gastrinomas. These tumours are called gastrinomas. And what happens is that this gastrin is overproduced and triggers those stomach cells in the stomach to produce more actual acid. So you actually have an overproduction and overstimulation of stomach acid. So that's where there's a condition or situation where there's an overproduction of stomach acid, which can also then lead to the conditions that I mentioned earlier. But those conditions are largely part to do with some form of lifestyle, whether it's poor inactivity, lack of water, or certain foods that we are having in excess and consistently over a long period of time, which is unfortunately not good for our stomach. So of course, seek medical advice when you do encounter these symptoms, because they can lead to something more serious potentially. So you want to get it checked out as soon as possible. But whilst that's happening, or even before that's happening, I'm the biggest advocate for preventing the preventable. And here is where I would really advise conduct a really honest and genuine food and water audit, food and drink audit, where for a whole week or for a day at least, literally write down everything you're eating. Be honest with yourself. Don't change your diet so then it looks really good if you were to give it to a GP or a nutritionist. Give yourself an audit and say, what is it that you're actually eating? And are there any actual foods and drinks that maybe I'm having too much or I'm having too often, and it can be potentially leading to the symptoms I have? It's not always the case, but why not actually rule that out before you actually go to the GP? So then you can look at something else that might be the likely cause of the symptoms that you have. That coughing, feeling very difficult to breathe sometimes. We think it's something else, but it actually might be heartburn. Many years ago, I actually had heartburn, and I had it really over here, and I was running to the doctor. What's wrong with me? I assume I'm a fairly fit individual. And at the time during my PhD, I wasn't eating as well as I should have. So that's why it's not as easy to sometimes understand what heartburn is, what acid reflux is, what that stomach kind of difficulty and discomfort is. So definitely check it out if you do have any issues like that. But now on to a very common stomach issue, and that is stomach ulcers. Because I mentioned about heartburn and acid reflux, but that's kind of more related to the effect to the esophagus. But what about something that's very common that affects the actual stomach itself? That's where stomach ulcers come in, or also known as peptic ulcers. And these are classified or characterized as inflammation of the stomach wall, so these sores that form are due to either some kind of bacterial infection, commonly known as Helicobacter pylori, but unfortunately even through the long-term use of certain medications, something known as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, something known as ibuprofen in the UK, or if you're in the US, I think it's called Advil or Adleve. And these can sometimes affect the stomach lining, which can produce these sores, which unfortunately cause a problem. Now, those sores can actually lead to belching, lead to the coughing, the difficulty in stomach discomfort from these actual stomach ulcers. And a large part of it can also be due to what we eat sometimes, but a large of it is due to excessive use of medications that we probably probably don't need to use that often. But what I want you to highlight is a common issue that affects the stomach and affects a lot of people without realizing. But if it's left untreated, if it's not looked after properly, it can lead to something a lot more severe. So a large number of things can cause these stomach ulcers, but I've touched upon the most common forms, which is the bacterial infection and certain medications that can severely cause those sores to form and encounter those conditions and those symptoms that we see. But before I go into the severe forms of things that affect the stomach, and the siren goes away, and it comes back, is that you may be wondering, how does the stomach look after itself in terms of the acid not damaging the cell wall and the enzymes not eating up the stomach itself? How does the stomach actually protect itself? So here's where the actual stomach cells produce a thick layer of mucus that kind of lines the stomach itself, so it prevents that damage from actually occurring. And it's when that mucus is eroded or is compromised, when the cells are damaged themselves, is when a lot of these issues actually start to occur. So the stomach does have its own defenses to look after itself, but once that's affected, it's going to damage and compromise the stomach as a whole. And lastly, I want to talk about something a lot more severe and a lot more concerning, which is stomach cancer. And the reason why I want to talk about it here is a lot of the issues that arise, and I've talked about earlier, are very similar to the early signs and symptoms of stomach cancer. So if the causes of what they are continuing, even though you're taking medication, even though you're taking some sort of pill, if it's continuing, it can cause so much damage that tumours can actually start to form. And I'm not saying that all of your symptoms are directly related to forming something. Predominantly, it actually isn't. But why have those symptoms in the first place when you can avoid it? And stomach cancer is a tumour. Nobody wants to get cancer, of course. And when it comes to the stomach, if we can avoid it, why wouldn't we? And sometimes it's where it becomes slightly concerning when the symptoms for stomach cancer are very similar, early signs anyway, very similar to acid reflux, very similar to stomach ulcers. So that's why when I say I'm helping to prevent the preventable, here's a really important reason why. Because now I'm going to give you some kind of stomach survival, stomach safety tips that are really essential. But you'll probably slap me and say, why is it so simple? So the first stomach survival tip is drink enough water. Sounds super simple. You probably heard it about 1,000 times. But the reason why it's so useful is it helps to dilute the acid in case the pH gets too much, helps to minimize constipation, helps with digestion, helps to keep your body hydrated as you know naturally. But the reason why sometimes we don't drink enough is I've actually known that many people don't like the taste of water. And if that's the case, what I've done recently is I've mixed frozen berries, took it out of the freezer, put it into a glass, left it in the fridge, put some water in it afterwards, let it, actually start to infuse, and it tastes amazing. Tastes like strawberries, tastes like berries, but I'm taking in my water. If you're happy with water, drink as much as you can when you can. There is this arbitrary unit of having 2 liters, but this does vary depending on the weather. It does vary depending on your body. But I literally have a look, how much water are you actually drinking, first of all? Now, you probably heard many advices from many people, but why not do the simple things well? And if you do them well, then you can move on to more advanced things. Then why start with some very advanced medication when your diet might be actually affecting you in the first place? So that's why I constantly urge, drink as much water as you can, where you can. Take it in the forms that you can. Don't bombard it with so much sugar, otherwise it defeats the purpose. Gets you get more dehydrated, sorry. I've actually really enjoyed mixing with a bit of fruit, and then every so often just refilling it, and it gets infused and infused again. If the taste is the issue, if you're worried about plastic, I bought these Voss bottles, so they're glass, they're fairly easy to hold and carry. Sometimes we just make excuses. So before we go anything further, first, are we drinking enough water? Just to look at. It may be something else. You may need medication, of course. You may need a lot of treatment. It may be something severe. But let's at least do the basics first, and then let's see what happens after that. Generally, as I mentioned earlier, conduct a food and drink audit of yourself for an entire week. See if you can actually write down what you've eaten, what you've drank in an entire week. And then sit down and see, how many of this am I having? How many of that am I having? How many of these drinks am I having in a weekly basis? And you'll be surprised with what you actually eat without realizing. Because a lot of it's actually a habit. It's not even willpower, it's biochemistry. You're very used to, or you're very addicted to a certain thing, and without realizing you're having this and you're having that. So before we go into, you know, what certain foods are really useful for your stomach, what certain treatments and medications are actually really useful, let's actually, can you hear the leaves, by the way? I'm walking on leaves. I've never done this before here, so let me know if you can hear it. But anyway, back to what I was talking about is, before we try and solve the issue, why not firstly try and identify what the issue may or may not be? What you may or may not have in terms of symptoms might require further treatment, might require a lot more investigation. But what you can at least do, you yourself, in your control, in your capacity, is at least have a look at what you are taking in terms of food and drink to start off with. We know about stress, we know about psychology, and that is universal for everything. But in relation to the stomach, because your stomach is going to process what you take in, let's have a look at what we're going in first, and then we need to assess and speak to qualified professionals, experts in the area, to understand, okay, if my diet is maybe okay, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, it may be something a little more severe. It helps them to then identify what it may or may not be, and hopefully it's nothing severe. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of things we can do in our control. We sometimes neglect, you know, me first and foremost, and we don't realize that this might actually be having a knock-on effect on my stomach and by virtue the rest of my body. So those are some real practical tips that at least we can do in our capacity. You don't need to be an expert in gastroenterology. You can do that and just literally have a look at, what am I actually taking in? And over time, if I'm doing this consistently and excessively, am I doing more harm to my body or not? It sounds so simple, but believe me, when's the last time you yourself actually looked at what you had in a day or even in a week throughout your whole life? So guys, hope you enjoyed episode 28 of the What Comes to Mind series. It has been a long time, you know, and thinking of the whole notion of what comes to mind in terms of the stomach, I genuinely think of the bombardment it has, the incredible understanding that our body has incredibly potent stomach acid, so hydrochloric acid, that I've used in the lab in my research when I was doing my PhD. And to think that corrosive potent power is actually in our stomach and being lined by mucus to make sure it doesn't harm the rest of the body, for me is truly phenomenal. So when I'm thinking about what comes to mind in terms of stomach, I think, how can that hold really, really acidic hydrochloric acid been used for the benefits that have been used for, but how our body, and in particular our stomach, is able to hold that blows my mind in particular. But I hope some of the information I have shared today is of benefit. I hope you enjoyed some of the nature I've tried to show you. It is fairly busy today, but I also hope I'm not being too rusty. You know, I was like, where do I look? I forgot. How do I put on the microphone? It has been a while, but I hope I've not been too rusty. Do let me know in the comment section if you can, and do let me know in the comments if you enjoyed the video. But I shall let you go, and I'll hopefully see you later on in the week with episode 29, which is going to be on the small and large intestines. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, see you soon.